This is David Rovix, and I'm here with Oregon author Paul K. Haeder, and we are working on a little presentation for the Oregon Legacy series. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions as an Oregon author. And first of all, how did you end up in Oregon, here in Oregon?
Well, I was in El Paso for 20 years as a journalist and teacher and activist, and we got a job offer, my wife and I, ex-wife, in Spokane. She took it. I was in Spokane for 10 years, but I spent a lot of time going to Portland and Seattle as a sustainability wonk, and then we ended up in Vancouver after Seattle, and so Vancouver, Washington. I got jobs in Portland as a social worker and teacher. So that was 2013. I've been there. But the funny thing is about Oregon is my dad was in the military. He left us some land when he died, and it
Hmm.
was land right across from Hood River in White Salmon. So I had been coming to the Pacific Northwest for over 27 years on trips from El Paso to enjoy basically Hood River, White Salmon, Clittertat County, and Portland. So
Is that Hood River area? Is that a remote area? What's it like? Kind of really rural?
well, Hood River across the bridge, which is that cool bridge. Have you been to Hood River?
Oh
And
yeah, around Stevenson, Washington.
yeah, so it's Bingham, and then it's White Salmon, and then 8 miles north of White Salmon, it is where I have property that has a pop-up trailer and a campfire, and a baby bear and 80 turkeys that live in the trees. Amazing.
Oh, nice, nice, lovely turkeys. So that's a really two different, really different experiences of Oregon there,
It
Portland and
is.
Hood River. You know.
It is, and El Paso is the Chihuahua Desert. So coming into the Pacific Northwest and that whole Columbia Gorge, at first it was quite dramatic, but I had been to better dramatic places like my mom's homeland in British Columbia. So I was used to trees that were giants, and so it felt very much at home because in British Columbia I went to school there for 1 year in Powell River, which is north of Vancouver, BC. So um, it all comes down into a circle. So I was born on the Pacific in San Pedro, lived in these islands in the Atlantic, right? And then I also am now in Waldport, Oregon, right on the Pacific again. So it's a full circle kind of journey for me. 64 years next month.
And also yet another really different little slice of Oregon there in Waldport between Hood River, Portland, and Waldport. And what does it? I mean, what does it all have in common? I mean, here we are doing this Oregon Legacy series. I also live in Oregon. I mean, there are very distinct similarities and differences between, say, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, other, California, other bordering states. What does it mean to be an Oregon writer, would you say?
Well, I got pretty much ingrained in bioregionalism. So, of course, William Stafford is an Oregon poet and a poet laureate, and his son Kim Stafford is in Portland. So it was very easy for me to embrace what it is to be a writer in Oregon because I already spent time with Stafford in Tucson when he visited, and in Spokane. So what it means is that we're sort of global. We believe in a journey as writers. I think Hemingway said, as in terms of all good books have one thing in common. They are truer than if they had really happened. And after you've read one of them, you will feel that all that happened to you, and then it belongs to you forever. The happiness and unhappiness, good and evil, ecstasy and sorrow, the food, wine, beds, people, and the weather. So if you take, and Hemingway was sort of an influence on me when I was 17. I've certainly evolved, but Barry Lopez. Uh, uh, we've even got Chuck Palahniuk, who is an Oregon writer. Certainly, um, we've got Stegner as an influence. So for me, coming to Oregon is sort of like coming home intellectually because I've always been tied to environmental activism and, of course, fighting against the timber industry from Tucson as a member of the Center for Biological Diversity makes sense to me. Having tree sitters fighting for one grand Sitka to me makes as much sense to me as fighting for a dam to fight against dams. So, here it is in Oregon, and I got to hang out with Edward Abbey because, again, I have Tucson roots as a writer and as a person. So um, every new place to me is always home to me, and I
Edward Abbey's kind of home territory, like the places he writes about the most, are very much in league with Eastern Oregon in particular, right? That kind of landscape, like Moab, I think of Edward Abbey.
yeah, Moab, Utah. Um,
Mm,
yeah, it's the West. Uh, so coming to Oregon was me working as a social worker and a writer in downtown Portland. So I'm looking at Oregon from the homeless and just released prisoner point of view.
mm,
But I always had that 20 acres in uh, north of White Salmon. So to get there, you go usually through Hood River and you resupply in Hood River. And it to me it seemed like my home the first time I ended on that property that my sister and I own. And like I said, my book Wide Open Eyes Surfacing from Vietnam is about my time in Vietnam, but me taking it to the Hemingway level. It's fiction, short fiction. It's definitely kind of cool that the introduction I wrote is a nonfiction essay about the power of the Vietnam War on culture, language, me. My dad was shot in Vietnam. He survived. It's just that when I went to Hanoi to do the in-service medical training before we went to the jungle, it felt like home 3 days after I was there because I'm in a country that reminds me of my time in Guatemala or my time in Quintana Roo or my time in Belize um, or in Chihuahua City or even in Juarez. So I tend to gravitate as a uh, German Irish American towards Latin America. And so when I went to Hanoi, I felt sort of like Muhammad Ali, who said, "Why would I go fight brown farmers in a country that we don't belong when they never called me the N word, and I'm called the N word here every day?" So um, it sounds corny, but you know me, David. I take my politics and my fiction and my environmentalism and my educating, unfortunately, deeply to my heart. So Oregon has the nexus of a very beautiful place. It's got the interesting history of the Oregon Trail, and it has a very dark side of sundown laws. It has a very dark side of here in my region of the Siletz tribe losing 1 million acres ceded to them by the government of the United States. Over the course of 100 years, they now have 3,000 acres. So it all comes back to social justice and how the world treats indigenous people or First Nations. So it's home positively. It's a great place for me to write, and it's a great place for me to understand that what's happening in Venezuela or in Peru or in Yemen is actually happening on our home front. And so uh,
And
Any
then
place.
also, like in terms of all those places you've mentioned, like also, and in terms of your book, Eyes Wide Open, and and really so many other things. I mean, you are living in a place here where you inevitably, especially in the different places you've lived here, you've inevitably lived next door to environmental activists and next door to loggers. You've lived next door to Vietnam War veterans and anti-war protesters, perhaps in the same person in many cases. I mean, it's a place of contrast, of so many different forms of contrast. People coming here because they love nature, and then other people getting kicked off of their land for being indigenous and forced to live in warm springs. I mean, it's a complex place to live in, to write about. I mean, it's sort of all here in a way, isn't it?
It is, and again, the West and the East Coast are used as pejoratives, right? Everything else is a flyover state, and I don't believe that. There's certainly Walport is a flyover town. Lincoln uh, County has massive housing issues that are equal to or larger than Portland. We have a housing shortage. We have the dichotomy of timber unity facing down older people that are fighting the aerial spraying of chemicals that are one element away from Agent Orange that cause birth defects and all sorts of neurological issues. So it all comes home to roost. I use Kiji Nishitanti's observation. Here's a quote: illuminating insight does not stop at mere contemplation. It is integrated with the deliverance of all beings in time from the universal suffering of the world. So my influences as a writer is all about, I think we all are recovering from trauma. We're recovering from, historical, institutional, systemic trauma. We are recovering from our own personal traumas in our families. And I think it creates a universality that I've always pegged into as a fiction writer. Forget about my journalism and my long form essays, but I think my fiction is different than most. And I know that I just got a piece from a writer who I have his book here, and he is a author who just did Seward Bound. So Sean
Uh-huh.
Ullman, you have that
That
quote.
quote, yeah,
Want to read it?
and then who is this? He's an author. Is he somebody that you've read?
Well, yeah, I have, but he's a new author who lives in Alaska, and he is part of the stable, and I'm using that in a kind way, of Cirque Press. So I just got this book, Wide Open Eyes, Surfacing from Vietnam, published by Cirque Press last year, and he just got his book, Seward Soundboard, published last month from the same press. And he
And he said it was like nothing he had ever read before. Your writing, which is pretty much the highest compliment I could
well, I
imagine
mean,
coming from.
I can read it or you can read it
Yes.
because
Do you have that quote handy? I don't actually. No,
um,
I just have another page up.
I think it's on my email, but I don't have it handy.
Oh gosh,
But you know what?
it
The
was a
point of
glowingly yes.
the quote embodies my fiction. So I mean, you can read the cover jackets of my books. So another influence is somebody Jim Crumley. So James Crumley, who wrote a book called Dancing Bear: The Last Good Kiss. Time magazine in the 80s called Crumley the next new noir detective literary writer. He was my thesis advisor. He was my thesis advisor in El Paso, Texas, but he was from Montana, so he got his graduate degrees from Missoula, and there's another Pacific North, well, not Pacific Northwest, but the Great Northwest. I spent time
The broader Northwest, huh?
up
And
in Montana, up
what
in
about your what about your what got you into writing fiction after a career doing journalism and teaching people how to write and do journalism? What got you into fiction, and how does your journalistic background inform your fiction writing?
well, the fiction happened as a student at the University of Arizona. So I was a journalism, biology, and English major, and I got hooked into the newspapers, but then I also interviewed visiting writers. So there was the University of Arizona's Poetry Center, and we invited everybody. We had I hung out with Kurt Vonnegut, even Borges. Who was an influence on me? Octavio Paz, Leslie Mormon Silko, Tess Gallagher, Denise Levertov. So I was around a lot of incredible writers. And so I started writing short fiction. And one of my pieces became the anchor for the new literary magazine for the undergraduate students. So it was the first time that a school like the University of Arizona, a big school, actually created a literary magazine just for undergraduates. Usually schools have literary magazines for everybody, and they're quite competitive. So the undergraduates said, hey, we need our venue. And so that magazine is called Persona, and my story Streets um, was the first long piece of fiction. It was probably the shortest piece of short fiction I've ever written, because I tend to not do flash fiction. I tend to do very long pieces. And so from that point on, I'm a journalist and a fiction writer and a poet. And my mind just absorbed that role tied to my political activism in southern Arizona, and then I ended up in Guatemala with some refugee camps in Mexico because of our the United States policy in supporting a dictator and a war regime in Guatemala. So
Were these refugee camps just over the Guatemalan border in Mexico?
they were, and so back then in the
Was it true from your experience that if there were Guatemalan military firing into the refugee camps in Mexico? Did you witness that, or did you hear about that?
Yes, so now we're going to take me to El Paso, Texas as a writer, and I ended up at the University of Texas, El Paso, getting a graduate degree, and I ended up working for Annunciation House, which is called Casa Annunciacion, and Ruben Garcia ran this refugee house in downtown El Paso, and I was a volunteer there, and I have written about this in various newspapers of our refugee intakes. And I know firsthand of Guatemalans who had their whole villages destroyed and people murdered uh, and forced off their land into those very camps that I visited a few years later in Mexico. So I have images of young children doing art therapy to help them get through their trauma. And there's pictures, and you can internet Google me, of helicopters shooting pregnant women in a child's coloring schema. So
Hmm.
did I get
In the
shot out
camps in Mexico, or you're saying that there were helicopters in Mexico
in
attacking these
Mex-
camps?
in Mexico, but especially in their villages in
Yeah, in
Guatemala?
Guatemala.
And those villages
Do you
are,
have do you have anything prepared to read for us? Do you have a poem?
yeah, I have a poem. I mean, the thing about poetry and fiction is that sometimes I start off my novels and my stories with a poem to get to use a kind of a mundane juices flowing thing. So I do these benediction poems a lot that I write for people that have passed, people that I honor. And so this is for my
That's what a
wife.
benediction is. Benediction. It's sort of like a remembrance, or is it? What
Yeah,
does benediction mean?
it's a remembrance, but because I'm the writer who I am, it's not going to be your Hallmark version of a it's going to be gritty. And it I if you can find that piece while I'm from you know
Oh, sure, sure,
John,
sure. Yeah.
this is called Upon Reclaiming a Clear Sky, with six herons advancing slowly but perfectly. And it's for my wife on the 2020 terminus. So this is written just a few weeks ago, December 27th. Bye bye the year of the rat, and welcome the year of the ox. Tucked in necks pushing against westward wind, reminders of strength, of nature, our human foibles, deadly dramas. You have shrouds, rainbow serapes, layers covering so much. Father's familiar dementia, severe religious dogma, a sister's daily protection as you held back what you could for a brother. Awakenings at the corona of upthrusted earth, rising to Pacific, you find a new you, layers peeled away, still the exposure, the tremors of past colliding into future, but you push through. Neck protected, nothing fancy, just tortoise determination like giant blue herons, those passing my window where words are my talisman. You are there in the moment, body stories of long lost aunts, those funny as hell tales of making out in a Pennsylvania cemetery, white girl with those black guys, the sum total of your life reclaiming lost narratives, those woven sheets of indigenous cotton, the colors of your past, beckoning a new, renewed future. One day, your stories will bring a chuckle to us all. So, that's
Mm-hmm.
me writing a poem for my wife from the window where I write all of my stuff in Waldport. And these bald eagles, certainly a murder of 40 crows, and then always these herons flying over Waldport. And it's captured in that 6 by 4 window overlooking my office. And
And what are you looking at? Are you looking at the ocean or at the forest?
we're poor people, so we're a block from the ocean. So we got a nice little bungalow, and I hear the ocean. But these creatures are going on traditional flyways. These creatures are going to the Alsea River to do their feeding. So that's what Oregon means to me. It means this confluence of people, of ancient, sad history, and people that are trying to understand nature in flux, because Oregon has really clear cut the heck out of the state big time. You can Google map that.
Yeah, and that's pretty evident, as I recall, in Waldport. You can kind of like in that area, you can see a lot of denuded hillsides. At least last time I remember being there.
well, Waldport is the uh, German name, and it's where the forest meets the sea is the PR spin for our community. Walport is not so clear cut. Where you're probably thinking of Lincoln City and
Mm,
Newport. I
mm,
mean, to think that this is one of the big tourist attractions in the world, and when you drive to Depot Bay, which is the smallest bay in the world, is their PR spin, and see those huge gashes of clear cuts right there where tourists see.
yeah,
It's sort of this schizophrenia that humans have with nature and with their own futures.
yeah. It is
Truly,
quite something without the veneer. When there's not even a veneer of something nicer to look at.
yeah, yeah.
And how did you end up on the coast, as opposed to in the inland reaches of the state?
I was working for veterans at the Salvation Army as an independent social worker, and that job, uh, like a lot of jobs, went south for me. And my significant other, who's now my wife, got a job in Newport from. She was working in Portland, and we said, "Why not?" So we had to find a place in Otis. It was the quickest place to find. We found a trailer, and ironically, we lived there 6 months before buying a really cheap home in Walport. Ironically, Otis is where the fires happened, and that place where we lived got immolated in the fires that we had in Lincoln County during the last year. So, um, odd timing, indeed.
Yeah, yeah. It ended up being good timing for you to be
Yeah.
living in the place that got burnt down. Yeah. Good move. Good move.
So to go back to that, Barry Lopez just recently died last month, and I want to do a there's an introduction to a 2002 catalog about artists. And this is what Barry said, quote, "The book is the container for the idea, but like the skull is an idea all its own. It is the suitcase that makes the idea portable, the pyx that allows the divine, Dante's Commedia, Goethe's Faust to be slipped into a pocket." And so even though Barry died in his 70s, he had cancer. He and his wife lost their home because of the Oregon fires. That says a lot to me. And the reason why I bring up Barry Lopez as opposed to Gabriel Garcia Marquez or all the other Latinx authors that really truly influenced me is because it's a benediction to this man who was muscular and very innovative in the way he did his books, Arctic Dreams of Wolves and Men, very powerful writer who, influenced me because as a fiction writer, I get influenced by nonfiction writers more than I do fiction writers. Um, on the Plains of Snakes by Paul Theroux is his recent book of Mexico. And Paul Theroux of Mosquito Coast fame, right? Uh, he lives in Vermont and Hawaii. He writes this book about his trip to Mexico, and even Mexican literary scholars say this is probably the best look at Mexico today than even what Mexican writers have written. So I get influenced by nonfiction to write my fiction, and maybe that's
Yeah, of
odd
course.
for people. I don't know. Maybe.
Art influencing life and vice versa. And I found the quote from Sean Ullman with the email from Sean. I mean, the best part of it is your book is like nothing I've read before, and I appreciate how raw and unfiltered it feels, yet also polished. I mean, that's the conclusion of his email, which I think is the highlight of it. But um, yeah, I don't know how much they're looking for a 25-minute segment, so I'm just conscious of the clock up there in the left
Well,
corner.
Rachel and Hobbs said 25, 30. I mean, I don't know
Okay.
if this takes up too much of the cloud, but I think we're okay if we go over to 35. I don't know. Do I have much more to say?
I don't know if, but I got time. But I think that's a good little author presentation there. If they're looking for something approximately 25 minutes, either. But you got another poem to close out with, perhaps?
Yeah, and see, the reason why I'm not reading from that short story collection is because the stories are not
They're
flash.
too long, right?
They're
And I
too
mean, it
long.
takes longer than yeah.
And I have great openings, but I don't think a part of a a short story is gives you enough. But I have another poem. I have lots of poems. I think I printed out uh, a couple short stories. So let me just can I do you think we have 5 minutes if I read a beginning of a short story that's not in the book that's but is coming out really soon?
Oh, sure.
Okay, it's coming out in the next Cirque 23 journal out of Alaska, but it's for the Pacific Northwest. Cirque Journal, CIRQUE, and it's called Johnny Boy, JT and Black Kettle. JT loves drawing sandhill cranes. Extruded from memory, JT sits on the sagging bumper of a Ford RV as he pushes capillaries of charcoal into the sky he delivers on the sketch pad paper. Unending fire sky, he tells himself. He wants to imagine the sky this way, Turneresque, electric, something like all those village buildings he left behind in Tenango, what seems like a lifetime ago. He steadies his hand and fingers, pushing and pulling like an archaeologist digging through strata for evidence of life. He has no need to jump up and start over with colored pencils, Prismacolor pens, or sloppy acrylics. The celestial rainbow of cirrus is a constant wash in his blinking moments, in between drawing birds of El Bosque and remembering war. The elegance of this bird, Antigon Candanius, JT knows is lost in his sketching, but each time a Rocky Mountain sandhill crane lifts, bouncing on air, dipping back into the water, JT understands the limits of art. It's easy to fold back 50 years. A half century passes from a youthful JT, soon a government issue grunt, then lifted out of Indochina with near spiritual mortal wounds into London to visit an aunt in Surrey, then off to France. It's a dream and nightmare, December 1968, a 23-year-old dream to see Paris. Walking for hours in Saigon, JT himself in the cubby of a wood carver, Vietnam carver Viet Myung, in an instant of harmonic synchronicity. The Las Cruces boy is being told about Southwestern Native American masks by a bamboo thin man in black silk and ensemble. This master of wood has long graying hair cuffed into a foot-long viper down his back. He doesn't display a traditional Fu Manchu beard of aging guys. Rather, this man's sideburns are something out of Dickens, Vietnamese lamb chops, curly hair like the dog sold in the markets for stir fry. I'm going to end there because it's a story. Again, here comes Vietnam again. This is not part of my book, but I've been so influenced by people that were either in Vietnam, whose parents were in Vietnam, who were in this country and they came of age during Vietnam, or even when George W. Bush declared victory in Iraq, and all of his generals said, "We will not have another Vietnam. This will not be another Vietnam." I'm afraid to say, David, that the Vietnam War is deeply embedded in our country's political force, and it shall be this month, and I believe it shall be in even 10 years. So there you have it.
So right, and then also in a very literal sense, you've got right here in Oregon a significant community of folks from Vietnam, as well as a whole lot of people who went to Vietnam under terrible circumstances some decades ago to kill people. But yeah, it's been a great. I think this is a great little presentation on Oregon writer Paul K. Haeder, and yeah.
I appreciate
That's
it.
good. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you,
It's
David, and your radio show, and I mean your podcasts are amazing, and I'm glad that you and I publish in the same online publication once in a while.
Dissident Voice, plug for Dissident Voice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Talk to you soon, Paul.
Take care, David,
you too.
and bye bye.